October 31st, 1974, Deer Park, Texas, a quiet Houston suburb. 8-year-old Timothy O'Bryan is excited. He's dressed as a Planet of the Apes character, clutching his trick-or-treat bag, ready for his favorite night of the year. His father, Ronald Clark O'Bryan, takes Timothy and his 5-year-old sister Elizabeth out with a neighborhood family. By 10 p.m., Timothy complains he's hungry. His father reaches into the trick-or-treat bag and pulls out a giant Pixy Stix, 21 inches of powdered candy, bright and colorful. "Here," Ronald says, "eat this before bed." Timothy struggles with the staples sealing the top. His father helps him open it. Timothy pours the powder into his mouth. Within minutes, he's vomiting. He complains of stomach pain. His father carries him to the car to rush him to the hospital, but Timothy begins convulsing. By the time they reach the emergency room, the 8-year-old is dead. Intent. Sometimes it wears a mask. Sometimes it hides behind a smile. And sometimes it masquerades as parental love while plotting the most unthinkable betrayal. What could drive a father to poison his own child on Halloween night? What kind of mind calculates murder in ounces of cyanide and disguises it as candy? And how did one man's greed create an urban legend that still haunts American Halloween celebrations 50 years later? Today on Deadly Intent, we're examining one of the most disturbing crimes in American history. Not just because of what happened, but because of who did it and why. This isn't a story about stranger danger or poisoned candy from unknown sources. This is about a father who weaponized Halloween itself, who turned childhood joy into a murder weapon, who was willing to kill other children just to make his crime look random. I'm Carmen Carrion. And on Deadly Intent, we explore the psychology behind criminal acts, the why behind the what. We dig deeper than the headlines to understand the human intentions that drive people to commit unthinkable acts. The Ronald Clark O'Bryan case is especially chilling because it combines 3 elements that make us deeply uncomfortable: a parent killing their child, the exploitation of a beloved holiday, and the cold calculation of treating murder as a financial transaction. This case isn't just solved. Ronald O'Bryan was executed for his crime in 1984, 10 years after killing his son. But understanding the intent behind his actions requires us to examine not just what he did, but how he thought, how he planned, and how he convinced himself that murdering his own child was an acceptable solution to his problems. In true crime, we often talk about monsters, but Ronald O'Bryan wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a church deacon, an optician, a father of 2. His neighbors thought he was friendly. His coworkers found him unremarkable. He looked like everyone else in suburban Texas. And that's what makes this case so terrifying. The intent to murder doesn't always look monstrous from the outside. Sometimes it wears a Halloween costume. Sometimes it hands out candy. Sometimes it tucks children into bed after poisoning them. So I need to warn you, this episode deals with child death, family violence, and the deliberate murder of a child by his parent. It's a difficult case, but understanding how someone could commit such an act helps us recognize the warning signs of financial desperation combined with moral collapse. Because on Halloween 1974, Timothy O'Bryan's father gave him more than poisoned candy. He gave him death, wrapped in the disguise of holiday fun. Before we dive into the horror of what happened, let's remember Timothy Mark O'Bryan. He was 8 years old, in 3rd grade, a normal kid who loved Halloween like millions of other American children. He was excited about his costume, eager to collect candy. looking forward to the fun of staying up late and going door to door with his friends. His father, Ronald Clark O'Bryan, was 30 years old. He worked as an optician, though he struggled to keep jobs. He was married to Danine, Timothy's mother, and they had 2 children, Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth. To outsiders, they seemed like a typical suburban family. But beneath that surface, Ronald O'Bryan was drowning in debt. He owed money on his car, his house, his credit cards. He had borrowed from friends, family, and colleagues. He was facing foreclosure. His financial situation was desperate. And somewhere in his mind, an unthinkable idea had taken root. His children were worth more dead than alive. On Halloween night, 1974, O'Bryan took Timothy and Elizabeth trick-or-treating with their neighbors, the Bates family. They went through their subdivision in Deer Park, going door to door like thousands of other families across America. At one house, the lights were off, but the children ran up to the door anyway. Jim Bates, the neighbor, waited at the street while the kids knocked. No one answered. The children ran back to rejoin the group. O'Bryan stayed behind. He lingered at that dark house for several moments while everyone else moved on. When he caught up with the group, O'Bryan was carrying 5 giant Pixy Stix, 21-inch tubes of powdered candy. He claimed he had gotten them from that house with the lights off, that someone had finally answered the door and handed them out. This is the first critical moment in understanding O'Bryan's intent. He didn't just give poisoned candy to his own son. He gave those 5 Pixy Stix to 5 different children. His own son Timothy, his daughter Elizabeth, and 3 neighbor children. Think about that. He was willing to potentially kill 4 other children. Children he knew. Children from his neighborhood. Children whose parents trusted him. Just to make Timothy's death look like a random Halloween poisoning. That's not just murder. That's mass murder attempted for the sake of creating a cover story. When the group returned home around 9:30 p.m., Timothy asked if he could have some candy before bed. O'Bryan pulled out one of the giant Pixy Stix and gave it to his son. The Pixy Stix was sealed with staples. Timothy couldn't open it. His father helped him, prying open the staples and pouring some of the powder into Timothy's mouth. Timothy immediately complained that it tasted bitter. His father told him to drink some Kool-Aid to wash away the taste. Within minutes, Timothy was vomiting. He complained of severe stomach pain. He started convulsing. O'Bryan carried his son to the car. By the time they reached the hospital, less than a mile away, Timothy was unresponsive. He died at 10:30 p.m., exactly 1 hour after eating the candy his father had given him. The cause of death was cyanide poisoning. The giant Pixy Stix had been filled with enough cyanide to kill 2 to 3 adult men. For an 8-year-old child, death came quickly and painfully. But here's what makes O'Bryan's intent even clearer. He had encouraged his 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth to eat her Pixy Stix too. She had started to open it, but she was tired and wanted to save it for later. That decision saved her life. O'Bryan had also distributed the other 3 poisoned Pixy Stix to neighborhood children. None of them ate the candy that night, likely saving their lives as well. To understand the full impact of the Candyman murder, we need to understand Halloween in America in 1974 and how this crime transformed a beloved holiday into something parents feared. Halloween as we know it, children in costumes going door to door for candy, became popular in America in the 1950s. It was a post-war phenomenon, part of the baby boom suburban culture where neighborhood safety was assumed and community bonds were strong. By the 1970s, Halloween had become a massive cultural event. Millions of children participated. Communities organized trick-or-treating hours. It was wholesome, fun, and seemingly safe. But there were already whispers of danger. Urban legends circulated about poisoned candy, razor blades in apples, and strangers harming children. These stories were largely myths. There were virtually no documented cases of stranger candy poisoning before 1974. The O'Bryan case changed everything. Suddenly, the urban legends seemed real. If a father could poison his own child's Halloween candy, what might strangers do? In the aftermath of Timothy's death, Halloween safety became a national obsession. Hospitals offered to X-ray candy. Parents were advised to inspect every piece of candy before letting children eat it. Some communities considered banning trick-or-treating altogether. The irony, of course, is that the danger came from inside Timothy's own home, not from strangers in the neighborhood. The person who killed Timothy was the one person who should have protected him, his own father. This pattern repeats throughout crime statistics. Children are far more likely to be harmed by family members than strangers. But the Candyman case fed into existing fears about stranger danger and transformed how America celebrates Halloween. Even today, 50 years later, parents inspect Halloween candy, partly because of what Ronald O'Bryan did in 1974. His crime created a lasting legacy of fear that outlived both him and his victim. The investigation into Timothy's death moved quickly. Within hours of his death, medical examiners had determined that cyanide was the cause. Within a day, detectives had recovered all 5 giant Pixy Stix, 4 that hadn't been eaten, and the remnants of Timothy's deadly candy. All 5 were filled with cyanide. This discovery immediately told investigators something crucial. This wasn't a random act by a stranger tampering with candy. This was targeted. Someone had specifically prepared these 5 poisoned Pixy Stix and ensured they ended up in specific children's hands. The question was, who? Ronald O'Bryan told investigators that he'd gotten the Pixy Stix from a house during trick-or-treating, but he couldn't remember which house. He said the lights had been off. He had knocked. Someone handed him the candy, and he had walked away. But there were immediate problems with his story. First, Jim Bates, the neighbor who had been with O'Bryan that night, contradicted his account. Bates said O'Bryan had separated from the group and caught up later with the Pixy Stix. He hadn't seen anyone hand O'Bryan anything. Second, investigators canvassed the entire neighborhood. They knocked on every door along the trick-or-treating route. Not a single house had given out giant Pixy Stix. Not a single homeowner remembered seeing O'Bryan at their door. Third, the Pixy Stix themselves were suspicious. They had been carefully resealed after being filled with cyanide. The staples looked new. The packaging had been professionally manipulated. Within 48 hours, the focus had shifted from a random Halloween poisoning to a very specific suspect, Ronald Clark O'Bryan. As detectives dug deeper, a pattern emerged that revealed O'Bryan's true intent. Just days before Halloween, O'Bryan had contacted his insurance agent, not once, but multiple times. He had taken out life insurance policies on both of his children. The policies were worth $10,000 each, about $60,000 in today's money. But that wasn't all. In the months before Timothy's death, O'Bryan had taken out additional policies on his children through his workplace. He had shopped around for more insurance, asking multiple agents about policies on his kids. In total, O'Bryan had secured about $30,000 in life insurance on 8-year-old Timothy, nearly $200,000 in today's currency. For a man drowning in debt, facing foreclosure, unable to hold down a job, his son's death represented financial salvation. Investigators also discovered O'Bryan's financial situation was even more desperate than initially apparent. He owed money to at least 20 different creditors. His house was in foreclosure. His car was being repossessed. He had written bad checks. He had borrowed money from coworkers and never repaid them. Just 2 weeks before Halloween, O'Bryan had asked his colleagues at work about obtaining cyanide. He claimed he needed it for pest control around his property. He specifically asked about how much would be lethal. The evidence was overwhelming. Ronald O'Bryan hadn't gotten poisoned candy from a stranger. He had created it himself. He had filled 5 giant Pixy Stix with cyanide. He had given them to 5 children, including his own son and daughter, to make Timothy's death look random. On November 5, 1974, just 5 days after Timothy's death, Ronald Clark O'Bryan was arrested and charged with murder and attempted murder. When we examine Ronald O'Bryan's actions through the lens of criminal intent, we're looking at one of the most calculating and cold-blooded murders in American history. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an accident that spiraled out of control. This was premeditated murder, planned over months, executed with precision, and designed to look like something it wasn't. Let's trace the progression of O'Bryan's intent. First, financial desperation created the motive. O'Bryan was deeply in debt with no way out. He had poor job prospects, mounting bills, and an inability to manage money. Rather than declare bankruptcy, rather than seek help, rather than face his failures, he looked for a way to profit from his situation. Second, he identified his solution: life insurance, not insurance on himself, but on his children. This reveals a particular type of moral collapse: the ability to view your own children as financial assets rather than human beings you love and protect. Third, he planned the method: the questions about cyanide, the research into poisoning, the decision to use Halloween candy as the delivery system. These weren't impulsive. They were calculated choices designed to create a plausible cover story. Fourth, he expanded the victim pool. O'Bryan didn't just poison Timothy's candy. He poisoned 5 Pixy Stix and distributed them to multiple children. This served 2 purposes. It made the crime look random, and it showed that O'Bryan was willing to kill other people's children to avoid suspicion for killing his own. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of his intent. Those other 4 children, his own daughter, his neighbor's kids, weren't even obstacles to him. They were just props in his cover story, expendable extras in the production of his alibi. Fifth, he played the grieving father. After Timothy died, O'Bryan cried. He comforted his wife. He spoke to investigators with apparent shock and horror. He even helped search for the house that had supposedly given out the poison candy. This performance reveals the depth of his sociopathy. He could watch his own son die from poison he'd administered, could see his wife's grief, could participate in the investigation of his own crime, all while maintaining a facade of innocent victimhood. The intent here isn't just to kill. It's to kill without consequence. It's to commit murder while being comforted for your loss. It's to profit from your own calculated evil while appearing to be a victim of circumstance. The trial of Ronald Clark O'Bryan began in May 1975, 6 months after Timothy's death. The prosecution's case was devastating in its clarity and detail. They presented evidence of O'Bryan's desperate financial situation, the debts, the foreclosures, the mounting pressure. They showed the life insurance policies he had taken out on his children, the suspicious timing, the amounts involved. They presented testimony from the insurance agent who described O'Bryan's persistent questions about increasing coverage on his children. They showed that O'Bryan had called his agent on November 1st, the day after Timothy's death, asking how to file a claim. Think about that timing. His son had been dead for less than 24 hours, and O'Bryan was already trying to collect the insurance money. The prosecution also presented evidence about O'Bryan's research into cyanide. Co-workers testified that he had asked about obtaining poison, about lethal doses, about where one might purchase it. They showed that the cyanide used to kill Timothy had likely come from O'Bryan's workplace or through connections there. They demonstrated that no one else had access, means, and motive to commit this specific crime. The neighbor, Jim Bates, testified about Halloween night, contradicting O'Bryan's story about receiving candy from a house. The other parents testified that O'Bryan had specifically given their children the giant Pixy Stix, insisting they were special treats. The medical examiner explained how cyanide kills, quickly, painfully, and in the dosage used, inevitably. There was no chance Timothy could have survived eating that candy. His death was certain the moment the powder touched his lips. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from O'Bryan's own family and friends. His sister-in-law testified that O'Bryan had no emotional reaction to Timothy's death until others were present. Then he would cry dramatically. Colleagues testified about his financial irresponsibility and desperate requests for money in the weeks before Halloween. The defense tried to argue that O'Bryan was being framed, that someone else could have poisoned the candy. But they couldn't explain the insurance policies. They couldn't explain O'Bryan's questions about cyanide. They couldn't explain why all 5 poisoned Pixy Stix came from O'Bryan's possession. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found Ronald Clark O'Bryan guilty of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The punishment phase was equally swift. They sentenced him to death. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, called O'Bryan's crime one of the most heinous he had ever encountered. The calculated nature of it, the betrayal of parental duty, the willingness to kill multiple children, all of it pointed to someone beyond rehabilitation, beyond redemption. Let's examine the Ronald O'Bryan case through statistics that reveal just how unusual and calculated his crime was. Filicide, the killing of one's child by a parent, occurs at a rate of about 2.5 per 100,000 children annually in the United States. But the vast majority of these cases involve different circumstances than O'Bryan's crime. According to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, 55% of filicides involve parents with documented mental illness or postpartum psychosis. 25% occur during acts of abuse that escalate. 15% are revenge killings, often in custody disputes. Only 5% are financially motivated murders like O'Bryan's. So O'Bryan's crime, a premeditated poisoning for insurance money, represents one of the rarest types of filicide. It requires not just the intent to kill your child, but the ability to plan it, to remain calm during execution, and to attempt to profit from it afterward. The financial numbers in the case are also revealing. O'Bryan's total debt in 1974, approximately $100,000 in today's dollars. Total life insurance on Timothy, approximately $200,000 in today's dollars. Time from Timothy's death to O'Bryan calling insurance company, less than 24 hours. Number of insurance policies O'Bryan had taken out on his children in the year before the murder, at least 4. Percentage of O'Bryan's total debt that would have been covered by Timothy's death, 100%, with money left over. This paints a clear picture. O'Bryan saw his son's death as a complete financial solution. Timothy's life was worth more to his father dead than alive. Or more accurately, Timothy's death was worth more than his father's moral character. The cyanide itself tells a story. Amount of cyanide in each Pixy Stix, approximately 2 to 3 grams. Lethal dose of cyanide for an adult, 200 to 300 milligrams. Lethal dose of cyanide for an 8-year-old child, approximately 50 to 100 milligrams. Ratio of cyanide in the Pixy Stix to Timothy's lethal dose, 20 to 60 times the amount needed to kill him. O'Bryan didn't just use enough poison to kill Timothy. He used enough to guarantee it, enough to ensure there would be no chance of survival, no possibility of emergency intervention, no hope of recovery. Finally, consider the trial and execution timeline. Days from Timothy's death to O'Bryan's arrest, 5. Months from arrest to trial, 6. Time jury spent deliberating, 46 minutes. Years from conviction to execution, 10. Number of appeals O'Bryan filed, 11. The speed of his conviction reflects how clear his guilt was. The length of his appeals process reflects his desperate attempts to avoid the consequences of his actions. To understand Ronald O'Bryan's intent, we need to examine the psychology that allowed him to commit such a crime. How does a parent, someone who watched their child be born, who changed diapers and kissed scraped knees, who presumably loved that child, plan and execute their murder? I consulted with Dr. Reagan Morrison, a forensic psychologist who specializes in familial homicide, to help understand O'Bryan's mindset. While she couldn't comment on O'Bryan specifically without having evaluated him, she provided insights into the psychology of financially motivated filicide. These cases involve a profound moral disengagement, Dr. Morrison explained. The parent has to reconceptualize the child from a person they love into an object, a means to an end. They create psychological distance through rationalization. In O'Bryan's case, we can trace this psychological transformation through his actions in the months before the murder. He started thinking of Timothy in financial terms, not as his son, but as a $30,000 asset. He researched murder methods with the same detachment one might research investment opportunities. He planned the crime around a holiday, when his actions would blend into the background of normal family activities. Dr. Morrison noted that perpetrators of this type of crime often share certain traits. They're typically narcissistic, viewing their needs and wants as paramount. They demonstrate poor impulse control around finances, but excessive control when planning violence. They're able to compartmentalize, to separate their role as murderer from their identity as parent or spouse. And critically, they lack empathy, but can simulate it when observed. All of these traits appear in O'Bryan's behavior. He spent money recklessly while claiming poverty. He meticulously planned a murder while appearing chaotic in other areas of life. He played the grieving father convincingly enough that some people initially felt sorry for him. But perhaps most telling is what O'Bryan did after Timothy's death. He didn't just wait for the insurance money. He called the insurance company within hours of his son's death. He didn't comfort his wife and surviving daughter. He focused on his financial recovery. He didn't confess when confronted with evidence. He maintained his innocence and blamed others. This reveals someone who had fully committed to viewing Timothy's death not as tragedy, but as a transaction. The psychological distance wasn't just a temporary state needed to commit the murder. It was a permanent reframing of his son's entire existence. The Ronald O'Bryan case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of intent and evil. Was O'Bryan a monster, a psychopath, or something more mundane and therefore more frightening? An ordinary man who made monstrous choices. The evidence suggests O'Bryan wasn't born evil. He had no history of violence. His childhood was unremarkable. He held jobs, attended church, participated in his community. By most measures, he was normal, but normality doesn't preclude evil. In fact, the most disturbing aspect of O'Bryan's crime is how pedestrian the motive was. He didn't kill Timothy in a fit of rage or psychosis. He killed him for money, specifically for $30,000 in insurance proceeds. This reveals a particular type of intent that's more common than we'd like to admit. Instrumental evil. O'Bryan saw murder as a tool, a means to an end, a solution to a problem. His son's death wasn't the goal. Financial relief was. Timothy just happened to be the most profitable victim available. This type of intent is especially chilling because it's so rational, so calculated, so devoid of passion or impulse. O'Bryan weighed his options and decided that murdering his son was an acceptable business decision. We can trace the progression of his intent. First, he normalized the idea of profiting from death by taking out life insurance on his children. Insurance itself isn't sinister, but O'Bryan took out multiple policies in large amounts, transforming his children from people to protect into assets to manage. Second, he researched methods, the questions about cyanide, about poisoning, about lethal doses. These show someone moving from abstract consideration to concrete planning. Third, He chose Halloween as his cover. This wasn't random timing. Halloween provided the perfect disguise. Candy poisoning would blend into existing fears about trick-or-treating danger. It created an alternative narrative where some unknown stranger was responsible. Fourth, he expanded the target to create camouflage. By poisoning 5 Pixy Stix instead of 1, O'Bryan attempted to make Timothy's death look like random chance rather than targeted murder. Fifth, he acted. He handed the poison candy to his son. He helped Timothy open it when the child struggled. He watched him eat it. He carried him to the hospital when the poison took effect, knowing it was too late. Each step required a choice. Each choice required pushing aside another moral boundary. The intent didn't arrive fully formed. It built gradually, as O'Bryan convinced himself that what he was planning was somehow acceptable. This is how ordinary people commit extraordinary evil. They don't wake up one day as monsters. They take small steps, each one making the next seem less impossible, until they've traveled so far down a dark path that atrocity seems reasonable. Ronald Clark O'Bryan spent nearly 10 years on death row, filing appeal after appeal, always claiming innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. On death row, he became known as the Candy Man, a nickname that referenced both his crime and the Sammy Davis Jr. song, which other inmates would taunt him with. He was not popular among fellow prisoners. Even in a population of convicted murderers, O'Bryan's crime was considered especially heinous. He gave interviews claiming he was innocent, that he had been framed, that the system had railroaded him. He never showed remorse for Timothy's death. He never acknowledged his guilt. He never apologized to his surviving daughter or his ex-wife. His ex-wife, Danine, divorced him shortly after his conviction. She changed her name and disappeared from public life, taking their daughter Elizabeth with her. Elizabeth, who had almost eaten one of the poisoned Pixy Stix, who had lost her brother and her father on the same Halloween night, grew up without her brother or her father. On March 31, 1984, the state of Texas executed Ronald Clark O'Bryan by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He was 39 years old. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered, some protesting the death penalty, but many celebrating the execution of a child killer. Some people wore Halloween costumes. Someone passed out candy to the crowd, a dark bit of symbolism that spoke to how deeply O'Bryan's crime had affected the collective consciousness. O'Bryan's last meal was steak, French fries, biscuits, and iced tea. For dessert, he requested candy, a final bit of dark irony that suggested he still didn't fully grasp the horror of what he had done. His last words were brief. What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who take part in any way in my death, and I would hope they would forgive me for likewise any trespasses that I have done unto them. Notice what's absent from those final words: any mention of Timothy, no apology to his son, no acknowledgement of his crime, no remorse for the death of an 8-year-old child who trusted his father to keep him safe. Even facing death, O'Bryan couldn't admit what he had done. He maintained the performance of victimhood until the end. At 12:48 a.m., Ronald Clark O'Bryan was pronounced dead. He became the first person executed in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. If the O'Bryan case happened today, the investigation would look very different. Modern forensic and investigative techniques have advanced dramatically since 1974. But perhaps most importantly, modern social media and crowdsourcing would have dramatically affected the investigation. Timothy's death would have generated immediate national attention. Photos of the Pixy Stix would be shared millions of times. Someone would likely recognize details about the packaging or the poison that could accelerate the investigation. That said, no amount of technology can prevent crimes like O'Bryan's entirely. The fundamental equation, financial desperation plus moral collapse plus access to means, still exists. Technology makes it harder to get away with murder, but it doesn't eliminate the intent to commit it. The Ronald O'Bryan case had impacts that reach far beyond the courtroom. It fundamentally changed how America celebrates Halloween and how we think about child safety. In the immediate aftermath of Timothy's death, Halloween 1975 saw dramatic changes across the country. Hospitals offered free x-rays of candy. Police departments set up inspection stations. Some communities banned trick-or-treating entirely or moved it to daylight hours. Parents who had previously let their children roam freely now accompanied them door to door. Homemade treats, once a Halloween tradition, became suspect and were often discarded. The spontaneous, community-based nature of trick-or-treating transformed into a more controlled, supervised activity. But here's the ironic tragedy. The changes were based on a false premise. The danger Timothy faced didn't come from strangers or from trick-or-treating itself. It came from his own father, his own home, from candy deliberately prepared to kill him. Despite this, the stranger danger narrative around Halloween persisted and grew. Studies have shown that actual cases of strangers poisoning or tampering with Halloween candy are vanishingly rare. Yet the fear created by O'Bryan's crime continues to shape Halloween celebrations 50 years later. As we conclude our examination of the Ronald O'Bryan case, we return to the fundamental question: what can understanding his intent teach us about preventing similar tragedies? O'Bryan's crime reveals several crucial insights about the nature of intent and evil. First, financial desperation can lead ordinary people to consider extraordinary crimes. O'Bryan wasn't a career criminal. He wasn't inherently violent. But the pressure of debt combined with the temptation of insurance money created a scenario where murder became thinkable. This doesn't excuse his actions. Millions of people face financial hardship without murdering their children. But it does suggest that financial stress plus poor moral character can be a dangerous combination. Supporting mental health resources and financial counseling might prevent some people from reaching the point where violence seems like a solution. Second, the ability to compartmentalize and rationalize is a key component of planned violence. O'Bryan convinced himself that his plan was acceptable, that he could get away with it, that the ends justified the means. He built a psychological framework that allowed him to poison his son while still seeing himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of evil. Understanding this process helps us recognize the warning signs. When people start talking about others as obstacles or solutions rather than as human beings, when they show increasing financial desperation combined with emotional distance, when they research violence in seemingly theoretical ways, these can all be indicators of developing dangerous intent. Third, the exploitation of trust is central to crimes like O'Bryan's. Timothy trusted his father completely. He ate the poisoned candy because it came from someone he loved. The other children accepted the Pixy Stix because a trusted adult gave them out. This reminds us that stranger danger is often misplaced. Children are statistically more likely to be harmed by family members than by strangers. Our safety education needs to reflect this reality while still maintaining appropriate trust in normal family relationships. Fourth, the performance of normalcy can mask monstrous intent. O'Bryan went to church. He worked normal jobs. He appeared to be a regular suburban dad until the night he poisoned his son. Most people would have been shocked to learn what he was capable of. This teaches us that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks banal, ordinary, even friendly. The intent to do terrible things can hide behind a smile, a church membership, a Halloween costume. Finally, O'Bryan's case reminds us that some acts reveal an intent beyond redemption. The betrayal of parental duty, the willingness to kill multiple children for personal gain, the complete absence of remorse. These things expose a moral emptiness that's difficult to rehabilitate. While we can understand the progression of O'Bryan's intent, while we can trace how he convinced himself that murder was acceptable, that understanding doesn't require forgiveness. Some intents are so profoundly wrong that they demand accountability, even ultimate accountability. The Ronald O'Bryan case stands as one of the most disturbing crimes in American history, not just because of what happened, but because of who did it and why. A father murdered his own son for insurance money. He poisoned 4 other children to create a cover story. He turned Halloween, a celebration of childhood innocence and community joy, into an instrument of death. And then he tried to profit from it, calling his insurance company within hours of his son's death. Timothy O'Bryan was 8 years old. He loved Halloween. He was excited about his Planet of the Apes costume. He trusted his father to keep him safe. That trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. But Timothy's story didn't end with his death. His tragedy led to changes in how we celebrate Halloween, how insurance companies protect against fraud, how law enforcement investigates suspicious deaths involving children. The prosecution and execution of Ronald O'Bryan sent a message that some crimes are so heinous, they demand the ultimate punishment. Whether you agree with the death penalty or not, the case represents society's collective judgment that certain acts place their perpetrators beyond redemption. Daneen O'Bryan and her daughter Elizabeth disappeared from public life after the trial. They changed their names, moved away, built new lives away from the shadow of this tragedy. Elizabeth, who narrowly escaped becoming a victim herself, grew up knowing that her father had murdered her brother and had been willing to kill her too. Today, 50 years after Halloween 1974, the Candyman case remains relevant. It reminds us that danger to children usually comes not from strangers, but from those closest to them. It shows us how financial desperation combined with moral bankruptcy can lead to unthinkable acts. It demonstrates that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks ordinary until the moment it reveals itself. But perhaps most importantly, it teaches us about the nature of intent. Ronald O'Bryan didn't kill his son in a moment of passion or madness. He planned it meticulously. He executed it deliberately. He tried to profit from it systematically, and he never admitted guilt or showed remorse. That kind of intent, calculated, remorseless, utterly devoid of empathy, is the most dangerous kind. It's the intent that treats human life as a means to an end, that views children as financial assets, that sees murder as a business transaction. Understanding that intent doesn't make what happened any less tragic. Timothy O'Bryan is still dead. His potential, the person he might have become, was stolen from him by the one person who should have protected him. But understanding how his father could commit such a crime helps us recognize the warning signs, protect vulnerable children, and ensure that never again is more than just a wish. Because on Halloween night in 1974, a father gave his son poisoned candy and extinguished a young life for money. That's not an urban legend. That's not a scary story to tell around a campfire. That's real evil, committed by a real person, with real and lasting consequences. And that's why we remember Timothy O'Bryan, not just as a victim, but as a reminder of why we must remain vigilant against the dangers that hide behind ordinary faces and friendly smiles. Thank you for listening to this Halloween special episode of Deadly Intent, examining the Ronald O'Bryan case and the tragic death of Timothy O'Bryan. If you're a parent concerned about Halloween safety, remember that the real dangers to children typically come from people they know, not from strangers. Focus on teaching children about appropriate and inappropriate behavior from trusted adults. Monitor relationships your children have with family members and authority figures. And remember that Halloween candy poisoning by strangers remains vanishingly rare. If you're experiencing financial crisis and having dark thoughts about solutions, please reach out for help. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7 at 988 Financial counseling services are available through many community organizations and nonprofits. There is always a better solution than violence. If you found this episode compelling, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with others who appreciate thoughtful true crime content. Every review helps other listeners find us and supports thorough investigations of important cases. Remember, monsters aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're fathers. Sometimes they're friendly neighbors. Sometimes they're deacons at church who hand out Halloween candy. The intent to do evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. That's why we must remain vigilant, why we must question, why we must never assume that normalcy equals safety. Timothy O'Bryan trusted his father. That cost him his life. Let his story remind us that protection begins with awareness, that safety requires vigilance, and that sometimes the scariest things on Halloween aren't costumes and decorations. They're the real monsters hiding behind them. I'm Carmen Carrion. Stay safe out there, especially on Halloween night. And remember, check your candy. Not because strangers might have poisoned it, but because understanding real threats is the first step toward preventing them.